The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, stained with blood and dust. Sarah Blackwood's hands trembled as she read the words that would shatter her world. Family murdered. Ranch burned. Come home. The crisp autumn air of Boston felt suddenly thin, and the medical textbooks scattered across her dormitory desk seemed as meaningless as children's toys. In that moment, the promising young woman who had dreamed of healing the sick transformed into something harder, something forged by grief and tempered by an unquenchable thirst for justice. Chapter 1. The Return. The stagecoach wheels carved deep ruts in the Nevada dust as Sarah Blackwood returned to a world she barely recognized. 3 years of medical school in Boston had refined her speech, straightened her posture, and filled her mind with knowledge that now felt utterly useless. Through the window, she watched the familiar landscape unfold. Sagebrush stretching toward purple mountains, the same sky that had sheltered her childhood dreams now seemed to mock her with its endless indifference. Her fingers unconsciously traced the outline of the small derringer hidden in her traveling coat, purchased with the last of her jewelry money in a gun shop that reeked of oil and desperation. The weight of it felt foreign against her ribs, but she had made her choice. The Sarah who had left for the east with starry eyes and healing hands was gone, buried beneath the ashes of the Blackwood Ranch. The town of Redemption hadn't changed much, though Sarah's eyes now saw it with brutal clarity. The same weathered saloon still dominated Main Street, its bat-wing doors swinging lazily in the desert breeze. The same cluster of wooden buildings huddled together like frightened animals, and the same mountain range stood sentinel in the distance. But everything felt different now, painted with the knowledge of what men could do when greed overtook their souls. Sheriff Morrison met her at the station, his weathered face a map of lines that spoke of too many hard decisions and not enough sleep. His eyes, once kind when he'd bounced her on his knee as a child, now held the weight of terrible news poorly delivered. "Sarah, girl," he said, removing his hat, "I'm sorry for your loss. Your pa was a good man. Who did it?" Her voice came out steady despite the storm raging in her chest. Morrison's gaze shifted toward the mountains. "Land speculators. Been pressuring your pa to sell for months. When he refused, he trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the desert air like vultures. The ruins of the Blackwood Ranch stretched before them like a monument to violence. Charred timbers reached toward the sky like accusatory fingers, and the wind carried the lingering scent of smoke and loss." Sarah stood among the ashes of her childhood home, her medical training automatically cataloging details her heart wished to forget. The bloodstains, the scattered belongings, the silence that spoke louder than screams. 5 men, Morrison continued reluctantly. The Garrett gang. They work for a consortium back east, buying up ranch land for the railroad. Your pa wouldn't sell, so they made an example of him. And your ma, and your brothers. Sarah's knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself to remain standing. In the distance, she could see the small family cemetery where 3 fresh graves marked the end of everything she had once known. The wooden crosses seemed impossibly small to contain the enormity of her loss. "Where are they now?" she asked. "Scattered. Some say they headed south toward Mexico. Others think they're holed up in the mountains." Morrison studied her face carefully. "Sarah, I know what you're thinking, but this ain't the time for revenge. Go back east. Start over. Your pa would want you to live." But Sarah wasn't listening. Her eyes had found something in the ruins, a small, carved wooden horse her father had made for her 10th birthday. Somehow, impossibly, it had survived the flames. She picked it up, running her fingers over the familiar grooves, and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest where her heart used to be. Chapter 2. The Teacher. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself riding toward the foothills where smoke rose from a small camp. Her research had been thorough, asking questions in the right saloons, following the right trails, learning that the Paiute warrior known as Running Bear had indeed owed her father a debt. 5 years ago, Thomas Blackwood had saved the man's daughter from a flash flood, refusing any payment except friendship. Now Sarah had come to collect. Running Bear emerged from his temporary shelter as she approached, his weathered face showing neither surprise nor welcome. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver threading through his long black hair, and scars that told stories of survival in a harsh land. His eyes, dark as midnight, studied her with the careful attention of a man who had learned that strangers often brought trouble. "Thomas Blackwood's daughter," he said simply. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Sarah dismounted, her movements still awkward after weeks of relearning how to ride. "I've come about the debt." Running Bear nodded slowly. "I heard about the killing. Your father was a good man in a world that punishes goodness." He gestured toward the small fire. "Sit. We will speak of this debt." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the flames dance between them. Sarah had expected to have to convince him, to argue her case, but Running Bear seemed to understand the weight of her request without explanation. "You want to learn to kill," he said finally. "I want to learn to survive. Same thing, in the end." He studied her face in the firelight. "Your hands are soft, made for healing, not killing. Are you certain this is the path you wish to walk?" Sarah thought of her family's graves, of the telegram that had destroyed her world, of the 5 men who thought they could murder her blood and face no consequences. I'm certain. Running Bear stood and moved to a collection of weapons laid out on a blanket, rifles, pistols, knives of various sizes. He selected a Colt .45, its metal dark with age and use, and handed it to her. Your father saved my daughter's life, he said. A debt of blood must be repaid in blood. But I will not teach you to be a killer, Sarah Blackwood. I will teach you to be justice. The lessons began at dawn and continued until her fingers bled and her shoulders ached from the weight of the gun. Running Bear was a patient but demanding teacher, correcting her stance with gentle touches, adjusting her grip until the weapon felt less like a foreign object and more like an extension of her will. Anger makes you sloppy, he told her during the 3rd week, after she had missed the target in a fit of rage. Grief makes you slow. If you wish to succeed, you must become cold as winter stone. I don't know how to be cold, Sarah admitted, her voice breaking slightly. Running Bear's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then you must learn. Because the men who killed your family are cold. They are winter itself, unfeeling, merciless, caring only for their own survival. To defeat winter, you must become winter. Day by day, Sarah felt the last vestiges of her Eastern education falling away like shed skin. Her hands hardened with calluses. Her aim improved from terrible to adequate to deadly. Most importantly, her heart began to crystallize into something harder than diamonds, more focused than a blade. You're ready, Running Bear announced one morning after she had put 6 shots through the center of a playing card at 30 paces. Sarah lowered the smoking gun, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Thank you. Do not thank me yet, Running Bear replied gravely. What you're about to do will change you forever. The Sarah who walks into town tomorrow will not be the same woman who walks out. Are you prepared for that? Sarah thought of her family's graves, of the dreams that had died with them, of the future that had been stolen from her by men who saw human lives as obstacles to profit. The Sarah who came here died with her family. What's left is something else entirely. Chapter 3. The Hunt. The first one was almost too easy. Jake Morrison, no relation to the sheriff despite the shared name, had been bragging about the Blackwood job in the Silver Dollar Saloon for weeks. He was a small man with nervous hands and a mouth that ran faster than his brain, and he'd been spending money like a man with a guilty conscience and full pockets. Sarah found him 3 sheets to the wind on a Tuesday night, stumbling out of the saloon and into the alley where she waited in the shadows. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped into the moonlight, the Colt steady in her grip. Jake Morrison, she said quietly. He spun around, nearly losing his balance, and his bloodshot eyes widened as they took in the sight of her. Who are you? I'm Sarah Blackwood. You murdered my family. The color drained from his face faster than whiskey from a broken bottle. Now wait just a minute, lady. I don't know what you're talking about. You're going to tell me where the others are, Sarah interrupted, her voice as cold as Running Bear had taught her to be. And then you're going to pray that God shows you more mercy than you showed my parents. The conversation that followed was brief and brutal. When it was over, Jake Morrison lay still in the alley, and Sarah walked away with the knowledge that Frank Garrett and his remaining men were holed up in an abandoned mine 20 miles north of town. She felt nothing. No satisfaction, no revulsion, no triumph, just a hollow acknowledgement that justice had taken its first small step forward. The second man took longer to find. Charlie Reeves had been more careful, keeping his head down and his mouth shut, but Sarah had learned patience from Running Bear. She tracked him for 3 days through the mountains, following signs invisible to untrained eyes, until she found him camped beside a narrow stream. This time, there was no conversation. Charlie Reeves died with his hand on his gun, and surprise on his face, never understanding how a woman in a traveling dress could move so silently, or shoot so accurately. 2 down, 3 to go. Chapter 4. The Reckoning begins. Word of the death spread through Redemption like wildfire, through dry grass. 2 members of the Garrett gang found dead within a week, both killed with surgical precision, both carrying signs that they had died afraid. The townspeople whispered in saloons and general stores, their voices carrying a mixture of fear and satisfaction. Sheriff Morrison found Sarah in the hotel dining room, calmly eating breakfast, as if she hadn't become the most dangerous person in 3 counties. Sarah, he said, settling into the chair across from her, we need to talk. She looked up from her eggs, her expression politely curious. About what, Sheriff? About the fact that Jake Morrison and Charlie Reeves are dead, and you're the only person in town with reason to want them that way. Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Are you accusing me of something? Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her face for tells that weren't there. I'm saying that mysterious deaths tend to follow mysterious arrivals. You came back from Boston with more than medical knowledge, didn't you? I came back for justice, Sarah replied simply. The same justice you should have been providing. The sheriff's jaw tightened. Those men were scum, I'll grant you that. But we're a nation of laws, Sarah, not vengeance. Laws. Sarah's voice remained level, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes. What laws protected my family? What laws brought their killers to justice? I've been back for 6 weeks, Sheriff. In that time, how many arrests have you made? Morrison had no answer for that, because they both knew the truth. The Garrett gang had money and connections, while the Blackwoods had been just another family of ranchers standing in the way of progress. In the arithmetic of frontier justice, that equation rarely balanced in favor of the righteous. 3 more, Sarah said quietly, returning to her breakfast. When they're dead, I'll leave town and never come back. You have my word. And if I try to stop you. Sarah met his eyes across the table, and Morrison saw something there that made him deeply grateful she wasn't his enemy. Then you'll be interfering with justice, Sheriff. I'd hate for that to be your legacy. Chapter 5. The Final Hunt. Frank Garrett was no fool. When word reached him that his men were dying, he gathered the survivors, his brother Tom and a half-breed tracker named Santana, and retreated to the abandoned silver mine where they had been hiding their stolen money. The mine was a fortress, with only one way in and high ground that gave them clear sightlines on anyone approaching. But Sarah didn't approach from the obvious direction. Running Bear had taught her more than marksmanship. He had shown her how to read the land, how to move without disturbing the wildlife, how to become part of the landscape itself. She spent 2 days circling the mine, studying the patterns of the guards, learning their routines. On the 3rd night she made her move. The old mine had a secondary entrance, a narrow shaft that the original miners had used for ventilation. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and it hadn't been used in years, but Sarah had found it on her reconnaissance. She lowered herself into the darkness, her heart steady as stone, her breathing controlled and silent. The shaft led to a network of abandoned tunnels that honeycombed the mountain. Sarah moved through them like a ghost, guided by the faint sound of voices echoing from the main chamber where the 3 remaining killers sat around their fire, dividing up the money from their various crimes. Should have killed the girl when we had the chance, Tom Garrett was saying. Frank, we gotta get out of here. This place ain't safe anymore. Nobody's running us off, Frank replied. One woman with a grudge ain't gonna scare the Garrett gang into hiding. Sarah almost smiled at that. They still thought of her as one woman with a grudge, not understanding that she had become something far more dangerous. She had become inevitable. The first shot took Santana before he could reach for his weapon. The second dropped Tom Garrett as he scrambled for cover behind a wooden crate. Frank Garrett, the man who had given the order to kill her family, found himself alone in the echoing mine with death stalking him through the shadows. "Come out," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Come out and face me like a man." "I'm not a man," Sarah's voice drifted from the darkness. "I'm justice." The final confrontation lasted less than a minute. When it was over, Frank Garrett lay dead beside his ill-gotten gains, and Sarah Blackwood stood alone in the silence of the abandoned mine, finally understanding what Running Bear had meant about the cost of justice. Chapter 6. The Truth Revealed. Sarah returned to town as the sun rose over the desert, her horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust that caught the morning light like prayers made visible. She had expected to feel different, completed, perhaps, or at least satisfied that her family's deaths had been answered. Instead, she felt only a vast emptiness, as if the fire that had driven her for months had finally burned itself out. Sheriff Morrison was waiting for her at the hotel, his face grim with knowledge he wished he didn't possess. "It's done," Sarah said simply, dismounting from her horse. "I figured as much." Morrison removed his hat, running weathered fingers through his gray hair. "Sarah, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you weeks ago." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. "What is it?" "The Garrett gang. They weren't working alone. There was someone else involved. Someone who's been pulling the strings from the beginning." Morrison's voice was heavy with shame. "Someone who knew your family's routines, knew when your pa would be home alone, knew exactly how to make it look like a simple land grab." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. "Who?" "Your brother, your eldest brother, Marcus." The words hit her like a physical blow. Marcus, who had left the ranch 2 years ago after fighting with their father about money. Marcus, who had always resented being the oldest son of a poor rancher. Marcus, who had written to her in Boston, complaining about their father's stubbornness and their family's lack of prospects. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. Morrison pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a telegram, yellow with age. "This came in yesterday, from the territorial marshal. They found Marcus in San Francisco, living under a false name with enough money to last 10 lifetimes. He confessed everything before they could even question him. Guilt, it seems, makes a man careless." Sarah's hands shook as she read the telegram. Marcus had made a deal with the land consortium, information about the ranch in exchange for a percentage of the profits. He had provided the schedules, the routines, the perfect timing. He had thought they would just pressure their parents to sell, never imagining that violence would be necessary. But when Thomas Blackwood proved as stubborn as his son had warned, the consortium had decided that examples needed to be made, and Marcus, already in too deep to back out, had kept his mouth shut as his family was murdered for the information he had provided. "He turned himself in 3 days ago," Morrison continued. "Couldn't live with what he'd done. He's asking for you, Sarah." Wants to see you before what? Before they hang him. Chapter 7. The Final Reckoning. The train to San Francisco took 3 days, and Sarah spent every mile of it wrestling with emotions she couldn't name. Rage, certainly, but also a grief that felt even deeper than what she had experienced at her family's graves. This was the death of something she hadn't even known she still possessed, the belief that family was sacred, that blood meant something more than mere biology. Marcus looked older than his 28 years when she saw him in his cell. Prison had hollowed his cheeks and put shadows under his eyes, but Sarah could still see traces of the brother who had taught her to ride, who had read her stories by lamplight when she was small. "Sarah," he said, rising from his cot as the guard let her in. "You came. I almost didn't." She remained standing near the door, maintaining distance between them as if proximity might somehow contaminate her with his guilt. "I know why you're here," Marcus continued. "Morrison told me what you did. The Garrett gang, you killed them all." "Yes." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with eyes that had once been kind. "You look different, harder. Men who betray their families tend to have that effect on their sisters." The words hung between them like a blade, sharp enough to cut and impossible to take back. Marcus flinched as if she had struck him. "I never meant for them to die," he said quietly. "You have to believe that. I thought they'd just make pay an offer he couldn't refuse. A little pressure, maybe rough him up some, but not what happened." "But you knew," Sarah replied, her voice as cold as winter stone. "When you heard what happened, you knew it was your fault, and you said nothing. I was scared. You were a coward." Sarah stepped closer to the bars, her eyes fixed on his face. "You let me spend months hunting the wrong men. You let me become a killer because you were too afraid to face what you'd done." Marcus's composure finally cracked, and tears began to stream down his face. "I'm sorry, Sarah. God help me, I'm so sorry. I never wanted any of this to happen." Sarah stared at her brother, the last living member of her family besides herself, and felt the final pieces of her old life crumble into dust. The Sarah who had gone to medical school, who had dreamed of healing and helping, who had believed in the fundamental goodness of people, was truly and completely dead. "Sorry doesn't bring them back," she said finally. "Sorry doesn't undo what you've made me become." She turned to leave, but Marcus's voice stopped her at the door. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah looked back at him one last time, memorizing the face that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. "Now you hang," she said, "and I live with what we've both become." Epilogue: The Price of Justice. 10 years later, Dr. Sarah Blackwood ran a small clinic in the mountain town of Silver Creek, Colorado. She treated minors' injuries and delivered babies, prescribed laudanum for pain, and performed surgery by lamplight when necessary. The townspeople respected her skill and appreciated her dedication, but they also sensed something untouchable about her, a core of winter that never quite thawed, even in the warmest company. She never married, though she had opportunities. She never spoke of her past, though rumors followed her like shadows, and she never touched a gun again, though one hung over her mantle as a reminder of what justice could cost. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind howled down from the peaks, Sarah would sit by her window and remember the girl who had wanted to heal the world. That girl had died in the Nevada desert, murdered as surely as her family had been, and in her place stood a woman who understood that love and justice were not always the same thing. But in the moments between sleep and waking, when the boundaries between memory and dream grew thin, Sarah sometimes allowed herself to imagine a different ending to her story. One where her brother had chosen differently, where justice had been served by courts instead of bullets, where the girl with healing hands had never learned to kill. In those moments she understood that love was indeed transcendent, not because it conquered all, but because it endured even when all seemed lost. The love for her murdered family had driven her to become something terrible and necessary. The love for the brother who had betrayed them had nearly destroyed her. But the love for the broken and suffering people who came to her clinic had slowly, carefully begun to rebuild something resembling a soul. It wasn't redemption, exactly. Some sins were too deep for washing clean. But it was, perhaps, enough, a way to honor the dead while serving the living, a path that led neither to sainthood nor damnation, but to something more complex and ultimately more human. Sarah Blackwood had learned that justice was not always just, that family was not always sacred, and that love could survive even the worst betrayals. In the end, that knowledge had cost her everything she thought she wanted, but had given her something she had never expected to find, a purpose that transcended vengeance, a healing that encompassed both the giver and the receiver, and a kind of peace that could only be found on the far side of unforgivable pain. The girl who had wanted to heal the world was dead, but the woman who remained was still healing, one patient at a time, one day at a time, one breath at a time, and sometimes, in the quiet moments between heartbeats, that felt like enough. In the mountains of Colorado, where the wind carries stories of love and loss across the peaks, Dr. Sarah Blackwood continued her work. The gun above her mantle gathered dust, but her hands, once made for killing, had remembered how to heal. And in that remembering, she found the only kind of redemption available to those who have walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged, scarred but still breathing, on the other side. Love, she had learned, truly did transcend all boundaries, not by erasing them, but by teaching us how to live with them, how to find meaning in the midst of meaninglessness, and how to choose healing over harm, even when harm would be easier, even when harm would feel like justice. Especially then,